Good morning, everyone. This is Andrew Agris with LA NHRA. It is 10:02. People are joining as we speak, so we are going to give it a couple of seconds and we will start momentarily. All right, we will get started. Good morning again. My name is Andrew Agris. I am past president and program chair for the Los Angeles National Human Resources Association. This is our fifth or sixth webinar based on COVID. I've lost count and I have a tough time figuring out what day it is. So we'll just say this is the sixth webinar that we've done during the COVID crisis. And today we are thrilled to have with us the Senior Vice President of Human Resources, Bethany Ellis from Boingo Wireless, Nicole Kamm, partner with Fisher Phillips, Los Angeles, Hannah Sweiss, attorney and associate with Fisher Phillips, Los Angeles as well. Today, we are going to be focusing specifically on return to work. We're going to hear from Bethany and from Fisher Phillips, and I'm here from Bethany from Boingo Wireless on how they reacted to the COVID crisis and what they've done to pivot and how they plan to return to work as all of our community members in NHRA are now trying to figure out. We are going to make this an engaging conversation between Bethany, Hannah, and Nicole. And as Bethany is sharing what their return to work practices are, Nicole and Hannah are going to speak from the legal perspective, what they're seeing in the marketplace, what best practices are, what you should avoid, what you shouldn't avoid. And we're going to review not just what Boingo is doing, but also answering some questions from you, the community as well. A couple of house cleaning tips. If you're going to be dialing in, use the toll-free conference line and use the PIN number. If you're streaming on the computer, best to use your headphones. We are going to be taking questions. There is a Q&A box, but we're going to stick with the chat box. So please, if you have questions, keep your questions in the chat box and don't use the Q&A box because we will not be monitoring the Q&A box. Next week, we have another webinar that's going to be focused on workers' compensation, business interruption, and that will be done by Liang Ia from Bolton & Company, as well as Nicole and Hannah from Fisher Phillips. There's a lot that's going on in the workers' compensation world, as you know. There's a lot going on in the commercial insurance world, as you know, and it's ever changing. And we seem to be getting updates from the insurance commissioner in California, at least almost every other week. So we're going to be focusing on that next week. As far as today, I'm going to turn it over to Nicole, Bethany, and Hannah. We will go for about 45 minutes to 50 minutes. And then we are going to do some Q&A. We're going to start with Bethany, who's going to talk a little bit about Boingo and their response to COVID-19. We're going to then merge into the return to work considerations and then take Q&A. So Bethany, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Great, thank you. So just to give you a little background about Boingo. Boingo is one of the largest providers of indoor wireless Wi-Fi networks. And we predominantly work in large venues, places like airports, stadiums, and military bases, and many other locations, but those are some of our big ones. Due to COVID, we have set up networks in quarantine barracks for the military and provided service for free to service members covering more than 7,000 beds. Not something that we thought we'd be doing at the beginning of this year. We are located in 33 states, and that does include New York City. And we have about 200 employees here in LA, so some of the hot spots. And we have some representation in Brazil, Dubai, and the UK. But just to give you a little background on who we are. And then how we've been reacting, pivoting, and managing the COVID crisis. Been an interesting process. In late February, we realized we were going to need to prepare for what we could now call the roller coaster of COVID. At every turn, we've tried to anticipate what's going to come next, because as fast as we can think about it, somebody is going to ask us about it. And it seems like that's just happened, especially the beginning, was happening on a daily basis, like I'm sure for many of you as well. Some of the first moves that we focused on were bringing the flu shots back on site. Can you imagine having the flu in the middle of this and worrying that maybe you have COVID, but you actually have the flu? So we brought the flu shot back, and we started training employees on taking their laptop home, making sure that they were able to work remotely. It just had all the things that were going to be necessary. And we started doing this in late February. And we set up an Ask Boingo dedicated inbox for a rapid response to questions that our employees had. And we began the Herculean task of securing supplies for our frontline workers because we are an essential business. By March 5th, our head of marketing, head of office management, and myself were well into a full-time job on this topic. March 11th, we announced that we'd be doing a one-day full test run of work from home, and it was going to take place on Monday, March 16th. That weekend, we got word that one of our employees in LA likely had COVID-19, but this is early on, and so while his doctor said he more likely than not had it, the CDC wouldn't allow him to have the test. And so we went on the assumption that he probably has it then, and we shut down all of our offices across the nation over that weekend. And then talk about timing. As you all know, on March 19th, just 3 days later, LA started the Safer at Home. So our test became our reality. We quickly learned that we had to ramp up communication. Our executive team now meets on a daily basis and has since we started this work from home. And instead of our typical all hands meeting, which we do once a quarter and would do in person, we now do a weekly live video meeting featuring our CEO and our executive team. It's been a great way to keep up momentum, to help people feel connected, and to celebrate our wins frequently. So much so that we actually get a lot of requests from our employees asking us if we would continue to do this even when we do return to the workplace. And we will do some variation on that. But we've also had to learn to be mindful of bombarding employees with too much information and too many communication pieces. So we've now created a communications calendar that is filtered through myself and the CMO to ensure that we're being thoughtful about how frequently we send communications. And we set a theme. So we actually have Mindfulness Mondays, Tools and Training Tuesdays, HR Wisdom on Wednesdays, although I gotta say sometimes it doesn't feel like wisdom. We're learning as fast as everybody else. But you know, that general idea, and it has made a difference to our employees' ability to pay attention to actually process the fire hose of information that's coming at them. But above all, we strive to show our humanity and empathy during these upside down times. We've stepped in with mindfulness tools, frequent reminders about our access to therapy and telemedicine. We've provided a work from home reimbursement allowance, guides for managers on supporting employees during difficult times, and tips for parents who became teachers overnight. And we practice saying thank you often for their hard work, especially for our employees who are on the front line every day. And that is where we begin the story of return to work. And we'll turn it back over to Hannah and Nicole.
Great. Well, Bethany, I mean, kudos to you and your team. You have done such a stellar job putting things in place, acting quickly, responding really just spur of the moment to these matters that are, you know, like you said, you're learning as you go, as are we. You know, these laws change daily, multiple times a day. New information is coming out constantly. And so staying on top of that can be a full-time job. It's our full-time job, but you have that and then some, you know, also working on all the other facets of your role. So definitely you have our respects and everybody who's on the line. In terms of from the legal perspective, now we're kind of transitioning away from the where are we at with COVID? How do we make these really quick decisions on the ground to what should we do looking into going forward? What are the things that we need to have in place as a company? What are the documents? What's the communication? What are the requirements? And what are the recommendations? And so what we want to do is we want to take that multi-tier approach. And as an employer in California, you're always having to be mindful of all the different rules that apply. So it's from a federal level, a state, a local, and then I like to say a local. Because we have federal, state, county, and then city. And those those requirements, those orders, they may overlap in large part, but there may be some inconsistencies. And so knowing which apply to which work site and to which employees is critical. And then digesting and then acting accordingly. If there's certainly more than one job site, you want to be aware of the orders that apply to each of the job sites and the separate considerations for each. So just in terms of an overall, the CDC released detailed guidelines for reopening just this week. There had been some pending proposals in different forms, and really kind of under the radar, the CDC released a 60-page document earlier this week, which has specific guidance for companies in terms of reopening, and focuses on specific industries like schools and camps, which is going to be very relevant as we head into the summer. Just general office space, restaurants and bars, and then also has a section for high-risk workers. And I know that that's been an area that there's been a lot of questions. There's been a lot of consideration about how to handle those high-risk workers, either the older workers or those with underlying health conditions. And many of the local orders reference high-risk workers. Some of the local emergency paid sick leaves reference high-risk workers. But now we have some guidance from the federal government as well, acknowledging this category of individual. And basically what the CDC said is that they're encouraging those individuals to self-identify so that employers don't have to make unnecessary medical inquiries. And so that's one thing that an employer can put out there, to self-identify. And that employers should take particular care to reduce workers' risk of exposure, while also being compliant with the ADA, ADEA, and any local similar laws. So this has kind of been the overall throughout, is we need to be, of course, providing as safe a workplace as possible. We need to be making considerations for our employees on an individual basis. But at the same time, these laws, the ADA, the ADEA, DFEH, or FEHA, they are not necessarily, they're not obsolete just because we're in a pandemic. And the DFEH did come out specifically and note that in their COVID-specific guidance, that just because we're in a pandemic does not mean that the laws regarding harassment, discrimination, or retaliation do not apply. So balancing that, finding that middle ground, and actually we're pulling in a lot of our terms that we would use in non-pandemic situations for this pandemic analysis, because we think that they're going to be relevant and can transfer very easily. So in addition to the federal, of course, we have California. California is taking a staged approach. We're heading into stage 2. We're in the early stages of stage 2, which means that essential businesses can continue operating, and then certain low-risk workplaces can open up within limitation and subject to the restrictions. So if a local order has certain social distancing protocol, those protocols have to be complied with. If there's other requirements in place, they have to be complied with. And then, of course, all the regular considerations of the PPE, which we're going to talk about further, face coverings, the social distancing, the sanitation, should all be in place, and the employer should have a plan for this before moving forward. And I've had several clients reach out and ask whether they, in their particular industry or their particular business, might be able to move a little bit more rapidly into stage 2. For example, a retail store that sells medical supplies or PPE type equipment wanted to know whether they could open up to the public on a limited basis, just a limited number at a time. And because of the location and because of the conservative nature of these orders, we recommended to maintain a curbside pickup and delivery only as of now until we have further guidance. And similarly, a client that provides valet services had a request actually from it was residential, to start up those services again. And because it's not within one of the categories, we suggested maybe trying to come up with alternative options, working with a facility to figure out street parking options or scheduling, maybe notice between the residents of when somebody's leaving and coming and going. So being creative, thinking outside the box while still complying with the orders. And then bringing it down a step, we have LA County, which also has revised their local order as of this week. So again, staying on top of the most recent order is very important. And the CDC guidance said that employers should check daily to make sure that they are not missing any new information that's come out. LA County has guidance and LA City also has guidance, much of which overlaps, but some of which is distinct. And generally the recommendation is to follow the more conservative approach, the more conservative guidance.
Yeah, and so that's perfect to, you know, kind of lead into looking at a phased approach, and what does that mean? So as Nicole is mentioning, really, you know, it's really important to look at what industry are you in? Have you been operating during this time as an essential business? What will your phased approach look like? Really will depend on what industry you're in and what you're doing, where you are. And, you know, as Bethany and Nicole both mentioned, I mean, as you all know, we're looking at this all the time. Within the past day, the city of LA has also updated its order. And so we're just, you know, constantly looking at these changes and, you know, having to adjust. So as we go through this next period of time in return to work, our phased approach may also be dependent a lot on these changes that are continuing to occur rapidly as well. And then looking at really who should return, and just because these orders lift or because there's guidance that says everyone can return, should we have them returning? And so these are really considerations to do with workplace safety, potential liability. So it's really important to think through whether or not it is critical for your employees to actually return to the work site. And so looking at the different positions and employees that you have, where they actually work, is all going to, you know, be important in considering that. Whether or not you continue remote work is also going to have implications, and whether or not that's something your company would like to do. But also thinking about the productivity, you know, with remote work and what is happening when employees are working remotely. So again, it's weighing all of these considerations, and it's really going to be different for each business. There isn't a one size fits all here. It is really looking at what works for your business, and all of that. So that's kind of, as we go into this section, it really is going to be very specific and dependent on what you're doing, where you are, and the employees you have. And so that takes us to our next section, in really kind of planning for return to work. So having a plan is really important. So it's not just important because you know, we're saying it's important. Well, the guidance says it's important to have, and also it is required. OSHA also has just updated its guidance as of 2 days ago. And so there's going to be new enforcement by OSHA. And so that's something really that, as we come out of COVID, something all employers are really going to have to look out for. And so having a plan is the number one item. It's a really lengthy document, but it's the number one item that's going to be looked at when an OSHA inspector comes on site or calls you. So if you have a plan in place, not only for that reason, it is important, but also for your employees to feel safe, to have a plan in place, making them aware that you're ready and going to provide the best and safest workplace possible. So all of that is important, and also that is what will be the guide to take you through this next, you know, period of time. So yeah, and also if you want to maybe touch on communication with employees, Nicole.
Absolutely, yeah. So it's very important to communicate your new policies, your new plans, your new expectations, all the items that have been put into place to ensure safety, to ensure the social distance protocol is complied with, of course, need to be communicated with employees. Employees have to be educated and trained, and some of the local orders actually require training with certain components. similar to the unlawful harassment training that has to have certain requirements within that training for certain industries. And you can find this on the California page, which has the industry breakdown. Reading the industry breakdown is really important because there are some specific training requirements for certain industries, including training regarding FFCRA, of course, safety protocol, and anything else that might be industry specific. And the training really comes into play. We've seen it in action. We had a client have a visit from an OSHA inspector, and the receptionist had been instructed and very well trained that no visitor or individual was to enter the workplace without a face covering. And the OSHA inspector actually didn't have a face covering, no mask, no face, right? Surprising. And the receptionist said, no, you're not allowed in. We have masks to offer you. We're happy to accommodate you, but you're not going to go any further into our workplace until your face is properly covered. And it happened to be that the OSHA inspector had gotten the wrong address and not actually intended to come to our client's office. But the real lesson is making sure that your employees know what the requirements are, know what the possible consequences of not complying with those restrictions. I have another client that has people go into homes or go around homes to do estimates. So it's in the residential construction, and they have to view the property in order to give an estimate. And so they have very strict requirements, both for the customer and the employee, about what is required as part of that process. There's not going to be any sharing of pens for signature. There's going to be e-signature all around. The employee has to self-certify before they leave their home to visit the customer that they have their symptom check, they pass a symptom check, that they don't have a fever, and that's going to be documented. And we're going to talk about that further. So having that plan in place in writing, because that's going to be the first line of defense in the event of any question, any claim, or any audit or inspection of any kind. And some of those new policies, we've been assembling on our end a really good set of policies, kind of foundational materials for clients to use. And among those include an employee acknowledgement of health and safety practices on return to work, symptom checklists, documents, acknowledgements if temperature is going to be taken in that process. Certainly you want to add to your existing handbook an addendum specific to COVID-19. And the reason that we're suggesting an addendum, because we're also making changes to our main template just long-term from lessons we've learned through this process. We want to be addressing in the event of pandemic, in the event of economic hardship, looking at our sick leave policies, looking at our accommodation policies, just generally. But for COVID specific, an addendum that has a FFCRA policy, that has possibly a remote work policy, an IIPP addendum specific to COVID, and there has been further guidance on that, both from state and federal OSHA. Anything that might sunset or might exhaust possibly by the end of the year, if not extended further, you want to have in that separate document. We also have the CCPA notice that you want to give to employees, customers, visitors, anybody that you are taking temperature or gathering information about symptoms, any medical or personal information. It's the California Consumer Privacy Act, and almost every business is covered by it. There are some small exceptions, but generally the approach is to provide the notice. And this, as I mentioned, it applies not just to employees, but otherwise as well. Hannah, do you want to add to the slide?
No, I think that really covered here. And just to add that really some of these, again, are required policies. We do have these policies ready, all of the new policies that are required and the ones that are recommended. In fact, most of them, we have a flat fee for all of those policies. So if that's something, you're looking into, implementing. So moving on, I think it'll be really interesting to hear more about Bethany's return to work plan, and then we'll go through that in further detail. Oops.
Okay. Thank you, everyone. So I was asked to talk about how we created the return to work program for Boingo. Of course, like most of you, we didn't have a COVID plan sitting on the shelf, but I do have an amazing CMO and I have an amazing HR team. And during this crisis, it seems like everyone is helping each other out, and not just internally, externally. People are willing to share at a level that I have never witnessed before in my HR career. I expect probably because we're all focused on the same issue at the same time and have the same lack of prior experience, but it's still an amazing thing to see. And I'm eternally grateful for things like the free webinars and resources that are offered by law firms like Fisher Phillips. And no, they did not pay me to say that. But it is extraordinary to see the resources that people are offering to everyone, and just at a goodwill level. And of course, I networked with fellow HR leaders through groups like NHRA and the HRPS, and people have been generous about sharing what their draft plans have been and what ideas they have for return to work and questions that they have. And know that every plan that we have is still a draft, because as you just heard from Hannah and Nicole, it's like every 3 seconds, it seems like something new has come along and now we have to go and update it again. So we have nothing that is final at this stage. It is probably going to be a draft for the next couple of months at least. And in fact, even in this, you probably saw me turning my head a couple of times because I'm writing down notes as Hannah and Nicole talk. I've learned a lot from them, even putting this presentation together, and from Andrew as well. And I expect that I will continue to learn on this session, particularly from people's questions at the end. Because it's still evolving, I also have things on my list that we haven't figured out, and things that I'm still worrying about, such as how far do we go with wearing masks in the workplace? And what do we do, and how do we address it if somebody forgets to wear it, or doesn't, by the way, forgets to wear it, or wants to forget about any of the other safety protocols that are in place? We have an SMS tool in place to quickly alert people if we need to roll back to work from home. But we were nominally prepared, obviously, to work from home the first time. People had that heads up to take equipment home with no notice, getting that equipment dismantled and into your car and taking it home. Or if you weren't in the office at the time, these are going to be things that are challenges that will be challenging for us to do if we don't get heads up and have to roll back. And we're small, but we have a lot of different work sites, and one size does not fit all. And I worry often about what's happening in different locations that I don't have my eyes on, or what things am I not seeing that need to be addressed because it's unique for that particular location. And even more, I worry greatly about the anxiety and the mental wellness for my employees when they return to work. When I went to the grocery store for the first time, my heart was beating out of my chest, and I was just going to the grocery store. But I can't imagine if you haven't left your house in a couple of months and you're now coming into the workplace and now there are people around you, that anxiety level that's going to build up is I'm sure going to be even worse than just a little heart pounding. So that worries me, and that's on my brain at this point. So that is the start of our return to work. And if we go to our next slide, I'll talk to you about some of the things we're doing to stock up. So getting supplies, as everybody knows, has been challenging. Probably the biggest surprise for us has been who we've been able to get supplies through. In particular, I'll call out Bolton, our insurance broker, because they have been helping us connect to other clients of theirs who do have the ability to get to some of these resources. So every once in a while, Andrew will get this email from me going, I need thermometers. Who do you know who has thermometers? Large volumes of hand sanitizing equipment. Also, we found stuff through our coffee vendor. Because of the business we're in, we often are working with construction partners, and they have had access to stuff. Our office designers, we just finished building out a space in Columbia, South Carolina, and the people who did the office planning and furniture, they've been helpful in helping us find things. Of course, the friend of a friend, our office manager has some amazing networks of friends, and our swag company. They were the people we got our first order of hand sanitizer from. So it's been unusual the places have come from, and creative for sure. So some of the things we're doing in the office, particularly with these supplies, is at every entrance we have sanitation stations or hygiene stations that will have all the cleaning products for employees to take with them and hopefully bring back to that station and not take home at the end of the day. We're setting up clean desk policies, which will mean that you will have nothing on your desk except things that are mounted. So at the end of the day, when you leave, it has to be completely free. No stapler, no pencil, no nothing. so that our cleaning companies have the opportunity to wipe down every surface that's there. And we're also requiring them from that sanitation station to be responsible for cleaning every single thing that they touch in our workspace. So we have cleaning companies and other people doing stuff, but we're putting that onus on employees too, to say, hey, you have to wipe down your keyboard as well. You have to wipe down the handles of a chair if you sit in a chair. So we also have people who took equipment home with them, as I mentioned earlier. So we are setting up holding areas where people, like if you borrowed an office chair, they'll check in their chair so for 72 hours, and then they can have that chair to take back to their desk, anything that can't be wiped down. And we'll be setting up policies for holding mail, which we do right now, but we don't have a lot of people in the office at this stage. But we hold mail for 24 hours, so no mail or packages can be delivered to anybody until it's been through that time period. And we're working on all sorts of safe distancing signage and visual aids for people, from the coffee and water machines that we will allow to have still operating in this time frame. You'll know where the 6-foot mark is if somebody's at the coffee machine, and you'll know that you need to wipe those things down when you're done touching them. Conference room plans that show you where you can sit before you enter the space, but also how to enter and how to leave the space. So think directional signage, so you know the flow of the space. And we're doing directional signage for office walkways, mean thorough walkways, so you don't end up in a face-to-face situation with another coworker. We in LA have an office building that's on multi-tenant building, and we're on the 23rd and 24th floor. And we've had some challenges getting a clear communication from them about the elevator. Right now, they don't have social distancing protocols set up. So while we're putting pressure on them to set it up, we're also now going to be working on a communication plan with our employees to reinforce the idea to be bold and enforce the social distancing. So if you're in an elevator with one person already and somebody else tries to enter, we're going to be helping them practice saying, I'm sorry, but you cannot enter. You need to ask for that social distancing from people. And we're also offering, it's I think technically called a no-touch key, but it's also called a cootie key. And once you learn that, you'll never get that phrase out of your head. And it's basically a little key that has a hook, so it will actually help with opening doors. I haven't personally tested that side of it, but we bought it because you can push the elevator buttons, because we don't have a no-touch system there. And it's optional, people can take them or not, but we're offering those to folks. And then we have a lot of decisions that we've been making on where we have to draw the line on what's optional and what's mandatory. You know, people are adults and we have to allow them to make some of these decisions. And things like, we've made the call that yes, we're going to keep drinks available to people, but we're getting rid of mugs and glasses. Everything has to be disposable and it's one-time use. And then we're not going to provide any more company meals or open snacks, but we will keep some of those individually packaged items. No food deliveries, because we're not going to be open for guests when we have a return to work, which means it creates an issue for us for lunch, because now we have 200 some odd people trying to use 2 company refrigerators to store their lunch. So we had to make the decision, do we allow you to use refrigerators? Because now you're going to have multiple people touching things in there. And we've made the call that it's your choice, is optional. But what we're doing instead is, we're not going to have a summer party. We are instead going to buy insulated lunch bags or coolers, and we have people in the field, so this actually works very well for them too. But the idea being, you could actually store your lunch at your desk, so you don't have to put it in the fridge. It'll be an optional choice for you, but we will make it something you could do if you wanted. And so many other social distancing, but I think those are the highlights and things that are a little bit more unique to us. And if you go to the next screen, we'll talk about some screenings.
Yeah, well, but I think,
oh, I'm sorry. I got so excited. I moved right on to the next section.
No.
Sorry, Hannah and Nicole.
I think it's great, but I think really, as you speak, it really highlights, it's really important to look at your particular workplace, look at your workspace, look at the building where you are, and it's down to very small details, even down to pens, even, and all these considerations about, the staplers on the desk and other things. And I think it's really looking closely and coming up with a plan, as you're mentioning there, about all these small things, and then constantly, updating this area based on all of those small things that come up. And again, you bring up, not having on-site food delivery. again, that's going back and looking at, what is your policy about having visitors and on-site, delivery and dry cleaning and all of those things. So, it's important to, as you're going through this process, look at what policy you may have had in place before, making sure it's in line with what you're going to be doing going forward. And then just continuing to keep updated on the CDC guidance, here on cleaning and disinfecting. I mean, they are constantly updating guidance in, different ways, and even particularly with regard to where they believe, the virus exists. They've changed position now with regard to whether or not it is on surfaces and can remain on surfaces. So, again, keeping all of those things in mind. And then, having the appropriate protocol in place, in line with the local or state that is required. Here in LA, we are required to have social distancing protocol in place. And then also having the proper signs, like you mentioned, Bethany, it's important to have signage. And there's required signage, but also other like practical, helpful signage, that will make sure people do follow the rules, because these are not something, everyone was used to before, they were in this situation. So they're coming back to a whole new situation. They're used to the workplace as it was before they were there. And now it's going to be different. So I think that's great. And I also think it's great to make sure people do assert, for themselves and, make sure everybody's responsible for following these rules. So one other tip we have here is just that making sure employees do sign an acknowledgement form, for the safety compliance. So basically your safety plan, you should have all employees, acknowledge that this is the safety plan, this is the protocol. But again, also, that helps address the concerns as employees are coming back. What is the plan here? And that helps ease those anxieties, because a lot of it is around, and, anxiety comes from the unknown. So that helps also, put that in place. And so moving on now to
Hannah, I'm just going to throw in one. There was a question with regard to supplies, and it has to do with gloves. So I'll go ahead, and I think that's appropriate to bring up then. So the question is, what are your thoughts on requiring gloves in an office setting? Certainly masks and face coverings are required by certain orders. Gloves, unless it's required by some sort of guidance or requirement, it can be optional. The thing to consider with gloves is that you don't want to be, or the employee doesn't want to have a false sense of security. There's certain training that has to be provided in terms of taking off gloves so that you're not then contaminating your hands by anything that you've touched. So you kind of want to think, is it appropriate for the position? Is it going to serve our safety and our sanitation needs and requirements? And then if you do provide them, providing the guidance and the training and the instruction in order to maintain those sanitation requirements, even in the event of using additional PPE. And there are certain different PPE for different scenarios. There may be employees who need booties. If they're going into certain environments, they need to be covering their shoes. They may need gowns. Some may need a face shield instead of a mask. And that's a question we've actually been asked quite a bit is, what if the employee refuses to wear a mask? Well, one, you consider, is it required? Two, what is the underlying reason why they are refusing or declining to wear the mask? And engaging in that, we're using these buzzwords of interactive dialogue with the employee to analyze, is this something to do with a disability? Is this something to do with a religious accommodation? And then engaging in that process to find out, can there be an accommodation provided? Maybe that is a face shield, maybe that is a different fabric of mask, maybe that's something, going through the different options and having that process just like we would in any other accommodation situation before having kind of a blanket rule. If you refuse mask, you're terminated, or anything along those lines. So that's as to mask. I don't know, Hannah, if you wanted to add anything to that.
No, I think that was perfect. And we'll go through a few of the other considerations when with PPE on the next slide.
Oh, right.
And so, yeah, we will, but I think that was not perfect.
Okay, great. So Bethany, I know there was a question of whether, I think it was, do you plan to do temperature taking? Do you want to talk a little bit about how you're going to handle symptom checks and temperature checks, and then I'll jump in?
Yeah, one of the questions was there a plan to take temperatures before your employees enter into the building?
I think that leads perfectly into our next slide, does it not?
Yep.
Well said. Oh, geez, that's right in front of me. I apologize. So I'll answer the question first. Yes, we are currently planning it. Again, remember, everything is a draft. When we actually return people into the workplace at a fuller level, we may make changes, and depending on guidance given out, of course. And we're in a lot of different types of work scenarios, but right at the moment, our current stance that we are doing is you are required to do a self-assessment on the COVID symptoms before you leave your home. And this doesn't matter if you're coming into an office or if you are working in the field. And then again, you'll do that same screening. If you're coming into one of our offices, you're going to do it again. Many of our work sites, because they're not our sites, they're a site we're going to, have their own protocol set up about what they're going to require. I would be surprised if they're not being asked to do the same COVID symptom checking once they get to the space. But we're asking everybody to do it before they leave their house, regardless. In our offices, we are doing temperature checks. We are not doing recorded temperature checks. We're not doing some alert that goes to HR. It is a private one. You walk up, it tells you what your temperature is, and we are asking you that if you have a fever, anything over 100.4, regardless of why you had the fever, you're obviously not feeling terribly well, and we're asking that at that point you return home. Not that you can't work, we're just asking you to return back to home to work from home. And we are, for our field people, providing thermometers to those who need one, because we do realize that this is actually a hard commodity for people to get. And it's mandatory that they need to do a temperature check before they leave their house. And then in all cases, we're asking them to report to HR if they in fact do have one of the symptoms on the list and or have a temperature. And we are not considering COVID testing or antibody testing at this stage in our office. But who knows, that might be something, depending on how the future rolls out, that we might consider doing. I feel like I missed a question. Did somebody ask? I think I just saw, are we capturing it? We are not. This is going to be private. We are not recording any of the temperatures.
Excellent. That's fantastic. From a legal perspective, I'll add a little, my 2 cents.
Yes.
But I think you're doing such a good job again. So looking at the guidance, the state and the local orders, and the reason to do that is because there are some localities that are absolutely requiring employers to perform temperature checks. I know a lot of employers are considering, should we not? But if you're in San Diego, if you're in Fresno, Modesto, you do have to do that pursuant to the ordinance. So that's one thing to consider. 2 is, again, how are you going to go about it? Are you going to have employees do the self-reporting from home? If you're requiring them to use even their personal thermometer that they have, we're always thinking kind of worst case scenario, but these reimbursement claims, I think they're going to be very common with employees working remotely, using their personal tools and equipment, using their personal internet, using their personal printer, and using their personal thermometers. And do you want to add a little to that reimbursement or acknowledge that part of the reimbursement stipend is going to be intended to cover the use of that personal item or providing employees with that item? And then if you're having employees come in early and have to stand in line for the testing, or if there's any sort of waiting period, considering that as paid time, and including considering the time that it takes them to take their temperature at home or do a symptom check at home. Arguably, they're under your control. They are acting at your instruction, and that could be considered, and likely will be considered, paid time. And so having employees capture that time and somehow accounting for it in a time record and making sure that it's properly paid. We certainly are foreseeing quite a bit of wage and hour issues arising from COVID-19, and so that's certainly one of them to consider. And then reporting time pay, if you have employees who come in, take the temperature, it's high, you want to send them home, considering whether there's a reporting time pay obligation. There are, reasonable minds can differ, and there are different positions on that, but certainly the conservative approach, until we have further guidance from the labor commissioner or the legislature, is to pay that reporting time pay of at least half the scheduled shift, no more than 4, no less than 2 hours. And this is for non-exempt employees. For exempt employees, it's always a different analysis. If they perform any work in the day, they're entitled to pay for that full day. So considering that. But of course, you can apply paid sick leave if they qualify for any FFCRA for any of the remaining time that can be potentially applied to the employee. The other implication to consider, of course, are the acknowledgement, the CCPA notice, and I do believe that that is available on our website. So if you go to fisherphillips.com, we do have some templates available. I believe that's one of them. If for some reason you can't locate that, or if there's any other templates or information that you'd like to review, feel free to reach out to Andrew or to me or to Hannah, and we'll walk you through that and we'll help you out.
So, and I saw a couple of questions come through, so I just wanted to address those here. And also just add, a couple of things as you mentioned, Nicole, the local ordinances, and in fact, there's local ordinances that specify the actual temperature, degree, and it's different than the 100.4. It is exactly 100. So I think really also even looking very closely at those, this is an area easily for employers to trip up, and a lot of issues can arise in this area. So really, whether or not it's actually mandated, if it's mandated, then, sure, you have to do it. But if it is not, it's really, as you're pointing out, there's so many things to consider. Somebody did have a question here about the CDC guidance and the EEOC and whether or not testing, really the guidance on that. So just to be clear here, so the guidance from the EEOC has stated that employers are allowed to take tests, a COVID-19 test, for purposes of determining if somebody has COVID-19. They have not yet approved or given any guidance as to whether or not, a COVID-19 test for antibodies can be taken. And so that's an important distinction to note. And again, this is guidance. EEOC has provided guidance. CDC has provided guidance. The local orders are actual requirements. So I think that's also important to note distinctions, and then just that there are a lot of things to consider here. And also very important to get consent from employees in doing this, getting consent form, whether or not you're doing a temperature check or you're doing a questionnaire screening or you're doing a COVID-19 test. So
I've seen a couple of questions, just one last one on the temperature taking. A couple of questions about if an employee refuses to go through this process. Yeah. And it's very similar to an employee refusing to wear a mask or refusing to comply with other social distance protocol or safety requirements. So you want to engage in that conversation, figure out what the underlying reasons are, see if it's something that can be accommodated. Maybe there's an issue with, again, underlying health, and you don't want to ask what any underlying health condition is, but just getting enough information to make that determination. Is this something that has to do with the screening process? Are there religious concerns? Are there political concerns? All these are kind of on the table right now. So not having that blanket rule of if you refuse, you're terminated, but going through that dialogue, that process, documenting it, the back and forth, seeing what accommodations can be made if reasonable, but also making sure that you're doing what's required by orders and what's recommended by guidance and what you need to do to ensure a safe workplace, because that's an employer obligation under OSHA, just under any circumstances. And so you do have to balance those considerations. So it's not quite a black and white consideration or response, as with many things in employment, but it is a process that you're going to want to go through. But having your your guidelines, your policy, your plan in place. With that, we are recommending that employees either self-identify or self-report, and we will be taking the temperatures, and this is the process. Having that all laid out is, again, going to be your first line of defense, that we had reasonable steps in place, that we were following the guidance and recommendations, and that we were doing everything within the bounds of the current guidance. And it's interesting because really, to think how far we've come in the past 2 months, beginning of COVID, we never would have thought to be taking employee temperatures. When we had, clients call and say, well, this person just came back from a trip from China, or their roommate came back from a trip from here, what can we ask them? We said, no, we don't want a perceived as claim. We don't want to, tread very lightly. And now we've had really an evolution of guidance and an evolution of understanding of what our obligations are as an employer.
So there's a couple questions I think we might want to answer before we move on. Bethany, one of them is for you, and then Hannah and Nicole, are you seeing this with some of your other clients? But David Anderson asked, what are you capturing the self-assessment results on an app? How are you capturing and tracking the self-assessments that your employees are taking?
We are not. We're not, just like we're not saving the temperature information. We are not
Right.
having people report to us that they have filled it out. You're doing it at home and you're doing it when you get to the office, but you are not checking into us unless you cannot pass one of those. I suppose if you chose not to do it, we're not going to know that you didn't do it. But that just as when you walk up to a restaurant and they have the list of the sign that says you have to have done all these, they're not recording it either. We're in that same style.
What are you seeing, Hannah and Nicole? Do you have clients that are tracking any of that?
Yeah, so we do, and there is actually a lot of new technology that's coming out, not only with assessments, but also with contact tracing. And so I think those are, technologies for employers to really continue to look out for. We have a lot of, we have actually, kind of created a list of some of the technologies that are out there right now, and we'd be happy to share that.
That'd be great. Yeah, and I think David had another question, and I think that might fall into the same category. What about self-assessments at home and at office entrance? What vehicle tools are you using for the self-assessments? Do you have the same information in that list?
We do. And again, some of that, it'll just depend on how the employer wants to handle it. Some can be just electronic. Some can be even as simple as just doing a form and reporting it. So yeah, I mean, it just really depends, but we do. We have a list that we could provide.
Okay, great. There's more questions.
I'll be checking out that technology. But can I just ask, as a speaker but has a question, is it mandatory that we track it? Because if so, I need to go back and adjust my draft.
So no, it's not. And I think that's really an important point. Is it mandatory to track it? Well, I think it is mandatory to, note if an employee has tested positive. That is, but no, you do not have to keep this information. There is no requirement. And with regard to the CCPA notice, even if you're not collecting it, it's good to have employees sign off on it regardless. That's basically what we are recommending is go ahead. There's no harm to go ahead and have them sign off on this, information. So that same notice can be used even if CCPA does not apply. And so, now if you want to talk a little bit about PPE, and we'll just touch on some of the other things. I know Nicole did touch on some of them. So, there's just a few things here.
And as we come into this, I think I saw a question. There's a lot of questions coming by, so I apologize. But I think I saw one about what are we doing with bathrooms? I don't know if it was to me or to others, but I will say it's been a question for us too. We have stalls. It's not a one-room bathroom. So we did consider whether or not we needed to mark off how many of them can you use and not use. But at the end of the day, we realized that in our bathroom stalls, they are solid walls all the way around you. So you have a shield between you and the person next to you. The place where we have the challenges is if everyone leaves the stall at the same time to wash their hands, then it's a problem. We have 4 maximum. And so we are creating signage that says something along the lines. I can't remember the exact words, but it says something like, listen up and be mindful. If there's someone at the sink stay in your stall and wait your turn type of thing, so that they keep the 6-foot distancing in. And we have handles on those bathroom doors. We don't have a choice about that. So we are putting out information that says it's our expectation that you use hand sanitizer when you touch doors and that you wipe down door handles, including bathroom doors.
Yeah, and I know I mentioned to you, Bethany, that one of the other CHRO groups that I'm involved in had one of the CHROs had mentioned that they're using something called a step-in pole. I know you looked into it, but it didn't work for Boingo.
It's not that it didn't work, it's just the to replace our doors was roughly $8,000 a door.
Yeah. Yeah, and for those of you that are looking for a solution where you don't have to actually touch the door with your hand, it's called step-in pole. And if you need more information on that, I can forward you the website.
That's great. And other just recommendations are to have as much hands-free, so hands-free soap dispenser, hands-free sink, hands-free paper towel dispenser is also going to be important to implement as possible.
So some of the other things for us, in the very beginning, so we're talking back in March, when hand sanitizer was impossible. Remember, we have a large population that's out in the field working in airports and things. And at that stage, what we ended up doing is sending out gloves, because they're touching public spaces. They were touching everything under the sky. Alcohol wipes, those single-use alcohol wipes, and pocket soap sheets. So, they're like individual soap sheets, so that on the off chance you end up someplace that where you at least have some water, you'd have a chance to be able to wash your hands, and it didn't have to be rushing off to find a bathroom in order to be able to do it. And then because the human touch, we tossed in some hard candies for everybody. I think we got more comments about that than the other stuff that was in the boxes at the time. In our offices where we have a front desk person or receptionist type person, we purchase sneeze guards. So they're actually freestanding, so they're not attached, so that at the end, when we do finally move back to a time where people are allowed to breathe on each other, we can just roll them away. And we're providing fabric masks. It's actually just shipped out last week to all of our employees across the nation. And for our field employees that are in spaces where they have less than 6 feet, so high density places, we've provided them with KN95 masks and directions on how to be able to reuse, and the rotation for being able to reuse those masks, and shoe coverings for the environments that for us, I think, is more a mental, safety more so than a physical, but we're providing them for those who are interested. Pocket hand sanitizers with refilling stations, and of course, reminders everywhere about hand washing. Those are high level.
Yeah, no, that's great. And so I think really too, and I know as we talked before as well, just assessing kind of what PPE is needed for what workers, and it won't be the same at your headquarters as it will be for offsite employees. So I think really looking at that and looking at, the extent. So maybe it's face masks for, the workers at headquarters, but it's full on, suits and gloves and, face shield and booties for, workers that are out in the field. And so I think that's really kind of from the assessment piece, looking at that and looking at your industry, looking at not, at your specific workers, and then just training them on how to use, how to dispose of PPE is really important. And then considering the reimbursement, as Nicole was mentioning, it's wage an hour. But again, if somebody refuses this, it's about engaging in the interactive dialogue. So I don't want to wear a face mask. Well, but why is that? Or I don't want to wear, whatever PPE it is. Why is that? Is it a religious reason or whatever? And documenting that process, and then also, making sure it's, you at least look into whether or not it can be accommodated. I did see a question come through, and I did want to address it, and it's with regard to documenting temperature taking, and would that be helpful for workers' compensation claims? So I think yes. I think one thing to consider is not necessarily maintaining the information, but it's really about the process. So it's about the process of having the safety plan in place, having the protocols, having the training. All of those are going to help you with not just workers' compensation claims, but other claims that could arise from this situation. So I hope that answers that question. And if not, I'd be happy to go into it further. So moving on to a big question. I think this is one that's been, kind of top of mind, and I'm sure many of you have maybe already faced these questions. So we wanted to address them.
So yeah, I'll go ahead, unless Bethany, if you have wanted to chime in as well, because this has probably come up for you. This is probably our number one issue that we're getting right now. Our number one question is, now that we're heading into phase 2 and businesses are starting to consider their return to work schedule, they're putting offers out and notifying employees who've been furloughed that this is the date we expect to return to work. Please let us know your intention. And the responses have been really all over the board. And it goes similar to that underlying question of, what is the reason why an employee might be saying that they refuse to come to work? Probably the most common, or a common, is that they are making more on unemployment than they would be in their position. And we've gotten different guidance on that. The Department of Labor said that that is not a reasonable basis to decline work or refuse work. The EDD, however, released some FAQs very recently. They've been updating their COVID-related FAQs, and there's some additional information on their website, very recent, that gives specific answers to if an employee is in a high-risk category, if an employee is afraid, if the employee's worker is not an essential business or a low-risk company and is starting to operate and they decline to return under those circumstances, or if they're being offered to return at a lower pay rate, a lower wage. And the EDD mentions in each one that there has to be a basis that the refusal is with good cause. But what is that good cause? And that the employee is declining what's considered suitable work. What's suitable work? But really, it's not quite the same response that the Department of Labor gave. But the Department of Labor was pretty much, if you're offered a return to work and you decline, you're no longer entitled to at least the federal unemployment benefits. The EDD is much more nuanced. In one case, the EDD's answer points out that you may be eligible to continue your regular unemployment insurance benefits if your employer has not complied with guidance for safety reopening. So that's, again, why it's so important to have these safety protocol in place and to be compliant. If you had childcare or transportation problems that you could not resolve, and that's an issue that we have seen come up quite a bit. I have to take care of my kids, childcare is not open, camps are closed, the school year is ending, camp is starting, but a lot of camps are not going to be operating. So if there's no childcare, or you have a disability or condition that your employer could not reasonably accommodate, that employee may be entitled to unemployment insurance. What we need to consider, in addition to the unemployment insurance, is, are there potential employment claims here? Are there potential landmines for us to navigate before we come to a decision about whether to confirm that voluntary resignation, or whether to provide further accommodation, whether to continue to allow remote work if possible? And so really what we want to be looking at is, what is the underlying reason? What accommodation might we be able to provide? What leaves might be at play? That employee might be entitled to FFCRA leave or emergency FMLA under the FFCRA. That employee might be entitled to just underlying SIF or FMLA leave, or they might have available local or state paid sick leave, or vacation even, that they can apply during that time if you choose to. In terms of the health issue, that's you're gonna want to go through that interactive dialogue just like you would with anybody with a disability or a health condition that's asking for an accommodation. And now adding to that list, anxiety or maybe depression, those could be disabilities now, even if they're prompted by our pandemic, that employee is still in that protected category, and you do want to go through that process. In terms of the "I'm just scared," that raises flags for us that, we don't want that employee to have any sort of grounds to bring a claim, as Hannah mentioned, an OSHA violation or citation possibly, or a whistleblower type claim that they complained or they had concerns that you were asking them to come back to an unsafe workplace. Maybe the social distancing wasn't being enforced. Maybe the training wasn't, they didn't feel the training was sufficient. Maybe the monitoring to ensure that employees were compliant was not, to their satisfaction, or was not actually what it should have been. Maybe the PPE was not being provided, all these different factors. So that's one to really tread lightly, because there's already been quite a few, I think an increase from as many as the OSHA's had in a year, they had in 1 week in March. So when it comes to those I'm scared or I don't feel safe coming back to the workplace, it's definitely important to handle those carefully. Really, one last one I'll point out is in terms of PPP, the Payroll Protection Program loan forgiveness. The SBA and the Treasury Department issued some FAQs on that, and one of the FAQs is, if I extend an offer to bring an employee back and they decline, will that impact my PPP loan forgiveness? And in that question, the answer provided a 4-part criteria that an employer should put into place so it does not impact loan forgiveness. So it has to be a good faith offer in writing. The employee's declining to accept that offer needs to be in writing, and that employee should be notified that they're doing so may impact their continued benefits. Again, this is coming from the federal government, which is kind of different from what we're seeing from the EDD, but possibly the additional benefits provided under federal, the additional $600 a week through July 31st, that might be impacted. So you want to have that documented as well. And so, having these files on each of these situations, that's going to be for purposes of seeking PPP loan forgiveness. We want to have that documented so that it doesn't impact our ability to seek that down the road.
So yeah, no, I think that's great, and that really covered all of that. And I think really important to just document and maintain whatever documentation for all those reasons that you pointed out. So moving on to, we've already kind of touched on, the positive, well, we haven't touched on positive COVID-19, but we touched a little bit on this area of, privacy concerns that could be raised with regard to screening, and then also contact tracing. So with regard to privacy, it is really a consideration how to maintain privacy in this setting. And it really will come up. So with regard to temperature taking, questionnaire screening, and with the COVID-19 tests, it's a real area that, employers need to look out for, and maintaining documents to that effect. So again, whether or not you choose to maintain the documents, they are considered to be a medical record and should be kept in a separate file. So that is one consideration. Also, with regard to the CCPA that Nicole already pointed out as well, providing that notice. And another thing really is now with regard to whether or not an employee tests positive. So if there's a positive COVID-19 test, again, raises privacy concerns. One, reminder is that the employee's name of who tests positive absolutely should not be disclosed. In some circumstances, it's really difficult that it would be only that person. So it's hard to really hide their identity. So one thing to do here is potentially get a consent form from that employee who tested positive, just as a precaution for the employer. Again, we can't guarantee whether or not that person would sign that form, but again, it's one additional measure as an employer you can take, in the event you have to go through the process of notifying. So the CDC has guidance, and in fact, on our website as well, on our FAQs, you can find exactly the protocol to follow if an employee tests positive. But really important here is going to be looking at who was exposed, who was potentially exposed, and then tracing that, right? And then also, who do we need to notify? Do we need to notify the building? Do we need to notify customers? Do we need to notify, all employees? At which location? Where? So these are all going to be considerations of how to handle the situation depending on where you are. With regard to contact tracing, as I mentioned, and I will include that in the information we send to you, is there is additional new technology that is helpful in conducting contact tracing. The CDC, as of May 16th, so just this past weekend, also provided extensive guidance on putting together a contact tracing plan. So that's really, it's a 56-page document, provides good help and guidance on that area in creating a contact tracing plan. So this will be critical is, how to report a COVID-19 test. Again, Nicole also pointed out, self-reporting is going to be key here. And then also just, making sure everyone is following the protocol properly in the reporting structure. And then, the only other thing I would say is that, I think it's interesting, Bethany, that you've already had an experience with a positive COVID-19 employee, which is not like, all other employers. So you got to have that experience before, going back, but it is going to be a big consideration. And I know Nicole's helped several, employers with this situation already. And so we're seeing this come up. So it's really something to have in place. And there is also social media tracking out there available for bigger employers to really track who's saying negative things in regard to COVID-19 on social media platforms. So that's another kind of new technology that could help in this area as you walk through this situation. How are employees experiencing this? What are they saying about the employer? And again, maybe revisiting too, what is your social media policy and all of those things, in this area. So in looking forward, right now, you may have a tentative return to work date for employees to return to the workplace, depending on where you are. Maybe you're already starting to return some employees, again, depending on which industry you're in, where you are, or if you've continued to work, but that's one thing to look out for. The other is really looking at whether or not there's another coronavirus explosion and having a contingency plan, because, we are all going to be heading back to the workforce, but, also planning ahead for what might come about if there's a bigger explosion. How do we roll back quickly? How will we handle that situation? This time we may have, obviously we're going to be more experienced, but just really thinking that through as well, because it can happen, and just being more flexible. So I didn't know, Nicole, if there's anything else there, Bethany, you wanted to add.
Bethany, there's a question about, I think it was about advice on how to roll out some of these new policies. I think it'd be great to hear how you've been doing it and how you intend to continue as time goes on.
Yeah, and just to add to that, one of the other pieces of that question was, rolling out the new policies, but then also dealing with those employees who have a personal belief that this isn't necessary, right? And maybe they're one of the people that's protesting in a couple of different locations. How do you handle those employees?
Well, I'm going to hold that one for Hannah and Nicole, but I'll do the first part on sending out policies. So our first group who are having to get these policies in place are actually our field folks. We quickly realized that in order for them to actually enter somebody else's work site, and you'll probably run into this when you have people come into your own, is that they wanted a copy of what is that plan that we have in place with our field and folks to make sure that they are being safe when they enter somebody else's space. Like, what are the safety protocols they're going to take? So we put together that, it's a couple-page document, and we are pushing it through. We use Bamboo HR, and we're pushing it through that system to everybody we know who has to go to a site. They're signing, acknowledging that they are going to do all those things, from temperature checking and the symptoms and our healthy workplace protocols, and it's being saved within our HRAS system. So it's available to both the manager and the employee at any time. And we'll do the same thing. We only have a handful of people who are actually in our actual offices. But as we start rolling people in, we will be pushing the same concept through our tools to our employees across the nation, or around the world actually. But most of our most of our policies, we will push that way, and we'll be doing training through micro learnings. We're switching to the company we used got acquired by Cornerstone. So we are literally in the process of making that transition this week. So we will be loading in all of our training into Cornerstone to push to employees that they will have to complete before they can return to the workplace as well. And I'm really hopeful they all agree to sign and return to work. But if not, I'll be calling Hannah and Nicole to say, okay, Tom doesn't want to come back. He won't sign any paperwork and he refuses to wear a mask. What do I do? I will be sitting down to have a conversation, I'm sure, about why.
Yes, exactly. Good takeaway. Yeah, and in terms of, again, just the underlying reason as to the pushback, if it is, a personal belief that's not based on sincerely held religious belief, if it's strictly political, we want to try and keep the politics out of the workplace. It can be very volatile, particularly, under stressful and current circumstances. So to the extent that you can, counsel that employee, if it is based on that, about what the company tolerates with regard to complying with policies, the expectations. These have been put in place with, attention to federal, state, and local guidelines and requirements. Some of them are mandated by law. Some of them are strongly recommended. So if there's anything specific that the employee wants to bring to your attention, you certainly will have that dialogue. But again, the underlying requirement is to ensure that safe and secure workplace. And if there's anything that can be addressed, then you certainly can consider that. But you really kind of have to make sure that you're enforcing those policies on a relatively consistent and even-handed basis.
I will add, so two thoughts. One, of course, we also will have signage everywhere. A lot of the things we're asking people to do is not something that they did before, so it's not front of mind. And so a lot of signage is going to happen. And our chief marketing officer, we write with a voice that is a little bit irreverent. So it's kind of funny, it's catchy, it's engaging. So that helps. But how you communicate the words you choose to use, I also think make a big difference. So a lot of the stuff that we're saying, it's not about you have to do this for yourself. We're very much communicating about you're doing this for you, your family, your coworkers, your peers, that this is, we're all in this together to keep each other safe and healthy. So it's not just about your actions you take are not just impacting you. It's just, I guess, framing.
Fantastic. Yeah. I think we're learning a ton about, the HR side of it, the really personal side, not just the black and white legal or the gray area legal that we always focus on. That's really helpful, Bethany.
I'll give you some warm and fuzzy. You give me a couple policies.
Right.
That's a fair trade.
I think they have the heavier burden for sure.
So we are at about an hour 20. We have about 10 minutes. We were going to do 30-minute Q&A, but we answered some questions along the way. Maybe we can squeeze in a couple questions here. There was one question that came from Jennifer that said, do you have any speculation on if the FFCRA will be extended specifically 80 hours EPSL and EFMLA?
Beyond December 31st, we have not heard anything, but there's still quite a bit of time left in the year that it will be relevant and applicable. And so even if, we all return to work and hopefully things, fall into place in terms of whatever protections we're doing and the whole COVID-19 calms down, it still will be in play through the end of the calendar year. So employees will still be entitled to use it for any of those qualifying reasons.
And this came up a couple of times in the questions. I'm not sure if that, if this was addressed or not, but if you have an employee that refuses a temperature check.
So I think, yeah, just in talking about that. So if they refuse a temperature check, again, it's really asking, why are you refusing? And then balancing whether or not, is there an accommodation to make? And asking them the reason. So I think as Nicole was just touching on, what is it? If it's a religious reason, again, it can't just be a religious reason and then that's it. I say it's religious and that's it. It's really an inquiry further than that, whether it actually meets the standard. But if an employee refuses, you can absolutely turn them away and not have them go in and refuse to allow them to enter. But the other thing, though, is really thinking about, you know, as Bethany's mentioning, this is really to make sure the whole workplace is safe. This is for everybody's safety. So that's why we have these protocols in place, similar to Nicole pointed out earlier, like the receptionist who refused to allow the OSHA inspector through because he wouldn't wear a face mask. Right. Again, if it's a requirement at the, you know, the local level to take temperatures, then you absolutely have to really look at it. Again, having the dialogue, but again, it's, you know, whether or not they'll actually be able to enter at the risk of exposing other people if they were to, you know, actually have COVID. That's the risk you're taking if you were to accommodate something like that. And also, again, going against an order. So anything else, Nicole, that you'd want to add to that?
We have a good question about whether or not that employee should be paid for the day if they're not allowed to come into the workplace. And you know, that's going to be kind of a risk tolerance for the company. Certainly the conservative approach would be to pay them for the day. Generally for non-exempt employees, if they're not able to work, if they, you know, if there's a reason why they can't work, they show up knowing that they have a temperature and you send them home for that reason, you know, arguably you don't even have to pay reporting time pay. For an exempt employee, if they perform any work during that day, let's say you send them home and they're checking emails and they're checking voicemail, you absolutely pay them for the day. You don't dock their salary. So it's going to be a little bit fact specific, and it's going to be a little bit in terms of, you know, what level of risk that the company is willing to take without paying. You can certainly be conservative and pay them for the day and say that we're going to have to be conferring internally and we will circle back to you on a going forward basis if this is going to be something ongoing.
Yeah.
So people asked about receiving some of the documents that Fisher Phillips and Hannah and Nicole had mentioned. If you're interested in receiving some documents, they can't be sent out carte blanche to everyone, but you can reach out to the panelists and request those documents, and Nicole and Hannah can engage you and guide you through that process if you're interested in receiving additional documents. We do have a lot of questions that are coming in. What we will do, because we're not going to be able to answer all of them now, is as the panelists will review them, we'll draft up responses and we can send them out to everyone. The link will go out to everybody with the recording for this webinar as well, probably tomorrow. There were a couple questions that came through around social distancing and policies for cubicles and desks. I know on a couple other calls, I've seen what some CHROs and what companies have done to implement a new policy regarding where people will be seating. What have you done with that, Bethany? What are you seeing, Nicole and Hannah?
So in our locations, we already are set up for 6-foot distancing. We have some constraints that we're going to have to put into place, such as we have sit-stand desks, and in one location, our sit-stand desk, the panel between you and the other person is only attached to one desk. So if you stand up, the other person potentially does not have a panel there. So if there's a person on the other side, our guidance is going to be, you may not use a sit-stand desk if there's somebody on the other side of it, unless they want to go in razors at the same time. In our other location, both desks have it, so it's actually not as much of an issue. But in some places, the people in our Columbia office, for example, they sit too close together side by side when they're in a 2-person cube. So we have enough space to move one away. So we've got desk moves that are happening. And we are also, predominantly what we will do is relocate people to other locations. And we're going to have to set some guidance around how you turn around in your desk so that you're not turning face to face with people. So they still have the 6-foot distancing, but what we don't want is that they turn around and start talking to each other either. Right. So that's what we're putting into place. But we've been, short of the panel that we're putting out for the receptionist, we don't actually need to redo any of our furniture. We're removing a lot of chairs, but we don't have to actually move any physical desks to be able to accommodate it.
That's great. You know, what we've also heard considered and what is a possibility is to stagger shifts, that if employees are working in too close contact, that you possibly rotate their in-office schedule. And so that if they can continue working remotely, alternating for at least a period of time, that's a way, if there's no way to, you know, to move the desks or to relocate to facilitate that. So staggered shifts, staggered returns, swing shifts are also things to consider. I'd love to share this great, I'm sorry, but let me just go, this great input from somebody, because we've been talking so much about going through this interactive process. Somebody wrote in and said that they had an employee who declined to have their temperature taken by the particular thermometer being used. They engaged in that dialogue, and the accommodation was that the employee was permitted to bring his own thermometer, solve that problem. So I think that's such a great message, you know, really simple, have that dialogue, come up with a solution and move forward.
Yeah, that's great. Well, we are right at about an hour and a half answering questions. As I mentioned, there's a lot of questions that we weren't able to get to. We will review them as a panel. And then, as I mentioned, the recording link will be sent out, and then we'll provide maybe some answers. If your question was not addressed and you have an additional question you'd like to answer, feel free to email the panelists, myself, Hannah, Nicole, Bethany. And if you don't have those emails, but you're interested, but you have my email address, you can always email me, and we'd be more than happy to, you know, get whatever information over to you that we can. We realize these are just, you know, unforeseen times, and that no one has the answers, and quite literally it's changing on a day-to-day basis, not as frequently as it was before, but still we are experiencing a lot of change rapidly, and we're learning as we're going. So our contact information is below. If you have any information, feel free to reach out to all of us. You can reach out to me as the point person. I'd be more than happy to try to circle back with you. Please join us next week when we are hosting the workers' compensation business interruption, all commercial lines webinar, and Nicole and Hannah will be joining us, as well as Liang, Ia, and a few other people on Liang's team from Bolton and Company. So until then, thank you for joining us today. Thank you to Nicole. Thank you to Bethany. Thank you to Hannah. And everyone, stay safe. Be safe out there.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Take care, everybody. Bye-bye.